Good morning, everybody. It's 9:30 and the inquiry has resumed. So we're moving towards the end of this particular inquiry. We've heard all of the evidence and had cross-examination. We've also had roundtable discussions on a legal undertaking that has been submitted and a list of possible conditions that I have been invited to use were I minded to allow the appeal. Couple of matters, I think, before we move to closings. First of all, I have received the Natural England email latest, a copy of that. Thank you very much for sending that. And Mrs. Page, I think you were going to come back to us on a number of queries I'd raised on some conditions about whether or not some of them were necessary. Would you like to come back?
Thank you. Yes, I have managed to speak to the case officer briefly and also the environment and health officers. In relation, I think, in relation to condition 18, which was the sampling of imported materials condition, we think that that is not necessary and could be covered by condition 20. In relation to condition 19, it is clear that on a development of this size, we would normally expect a desk study to be submitted at the application stage, and then we would conclude if an intrusive investigation was needed. The desk study wasn't submitted with this application, but conditions were considered reasonable. And condition 19, which was the contaminated land condition, is set out in parts. So part A, if the applicant can demonstrate that no intrusive investigation is needed, the LPA can discharge the condition at that point. And the reason it's required is agriculture as a previous use, and residential as an end use. Residential use is a sensitive use, and whilst the environment and health team do have sort of historic maps and aerial photos, it only ever gives a snapshot of the land use over years, and there are similar examples that they found on sites where agricultural use has been a form of use where once you start land raising or infilling, we can find details that might previously have been unaware to the LPA. So our position is that it is necessary and relevant. And the sort of phased nature of the condition means that it isn't overly onerous and is considered reasonable. Condition 20, which is...
Thank you, Mrs. Page. That's a useful explanation. I think probably then I ought to just give the appellant the opportunity to come back. Does that explanation, are you satisfied with that explanation, Mr. Warren? I imagine, well, you'd agreed for this condition anyway, so I suppose
absolutely
further comments, put it that way.
Yeah, we don't have anything further to say, I don't think, on that. I'm grateful to Ms. Page.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And then, thank you. Condition 20 then would only kick in relation to the existing use of the site, or the previous agricultural use of the site, if certain parts of condition 19.
Yeah, they go together, don't they?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Is that enough information? I'm happy to continue.
No, I'm happy with that. I suppose thinking about it, even though it is agricultural land, there can be instances where stuff has been dumped or infilled. I think your main issue is your main argument, and I think it bears weight, is that for a scheme of this size, it's necessary in the sense of it's sensible, just because of the scale of the scheme. I think that's the argument you're putting forward to me, and I see some weight in that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And in relation, I think the other points that you'd raised in relation to joining conditions together, we're more than happy with those to avoid unnecessary duplication. Condition 29, the gradients of the drives 1 in 12, that was suggested by the Highway Authority, but we don't think it's necessary given the topography of the site. There doesn't seem to be any need for that condition.
Mrs. Page, thank you very much. I think you've answered all the points I've got there. Good. Right.
May I just say something, sir, about the timing on conditions? Because I think there's a bit of tidying up to do, isn't there, as between the main parties to send you a final version of all of that? That's my understanding, unless you tell me otherwise, sir.
I wasn't anticipating that, Mr.
Ah,
I mean, I made notes on the issues that I've raised as I've gone along, so I'm pretty
That's
sure
fine.
I've got my views on those.
My
No,
mistake, sir.
I'm not looking for another revised list. Both sides will be pleased to hear, I'm sure.
Fine, no, I'm grateful, sir. Thank you very much.
Okay, good. Is there any other housekeeping matters or issues that either main party wish to draw to my attention before we move on to closings?
So I suppose I need to say this. Mr. Warren's costs application came to me a little bit before 9 o'clock this morning. I saw it just after 9. In consequence, I obviously haven't had time to reflect on it and to deal with it in my closings. I haven't attempted to. So I just asked for a little bit of time after the inquiry, as foreshadowed before, and discussed with my learned friend to deal with that if possible.
My intention was after closings to do a sweep up of outstanding matters that need to be submitted or responded to following the close of the inquiry. So I understand what you're saying. I'll pick those up, I think, probably after closings.
Thank you, sir. Most grateful. I've also seen that the appellant has kindly sent their closings in to Ms. Dutton, so I don't know if they've made their way to you. I've also done the same.
I've just been waiting for them. Something's pinged into my inbox just now. So, yeah, yes, I think I've got both closings. Thank you, gentlemen. That's very efficient. Good. Okay. Thank you. Well, with those matters out of the way, I think we can turn now to closing submissions. So for the benefit of the live feed, it's normal for both parties to provide closing submissions which set out their case, taking into account the discussions that we've had over the preceding week. And I'd like to call then first of all for the council, Mr. Defer, would you like to please provide your closing submission?
Thank you, sir. I'm suffering with a little bit of a cold as the week goes on, so I'll try and get through this without coughing and spluttering too much, and I apologise if I do. So remaining in dispute between the parties are two issues of planning judgment. First, it is the evidence of Catherine Backhouse that the access arrangements onto the B3400 are unsafe. Secondly, as Mr. Butterworth explains, whilst many aspects of the design of the scheme are acceptable, overall, the scheme has been less than well designed. The result is a perception of a cramped, first typo already, form of development which is not well suited to its location. These issues cause Mr. Butterworth to conclude that the adverse impacts, both individually and cumulatively, are such as to significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits of the scheme. So I deal with each reason for refusal in turn, those being the ones outstanding, and then I turn to the planning balance. So reason for refusal 1, highways safety. So it is common ground confirmed by the witness for the appellant in this matter in cross-examination that safe operation of the proposed junction is an important issue for the inquiry, and that if it is found that the junction is unsafe, that would be an important factor to take into account in deciding whether planning permission should be granted. Indeed, as paragraph 111 of the MPPF identifies, a finding of an unacceptable impact on highway safety would be capable of leading to a refusal on highways grounds. So the primary function, we say, of the B3400 in the locality of the proposed access is the movement of traffic. 85th percentile recorded speeds exceed 40 miles an hour in both directions. You have those details set out elsewhere. These recorded speeds include the speeds recorded within the 30-mile-per-hour zone to the west of the proposed access, and demonstrate that the existing speed limits, particularly the 30-mile-per-hour speed limit, are not being adhered to in this location. There is no frontage development in the vicinity of the access, whilst the proposed development would introduce some urbanising features, such as signage and lighting, the overall predominantly rural character of the road would not substantially change in consequence of the proposed scheme. There would be no frontage development, and the sense would remain of being at the edge, rural edge of a settlement. The evidence demonstrates that from the outset of the design of the proposed access, the relocation of the change in speed limit was an integral part of the scheme. The transport scoping note clearly included the relocation of the speed limit as an integral part of the design of the access. In Mr. Burbridge's words in cross-examination, at that stage, the relocation of the speed limit was a definitive part of the scheme. Further to this, the Stage 1 road safety audit included the extension of the existing 30-mile-an-hour speed limit within the description of the scheme, and this is plainly the basis on which the assessment was undertaken. Mr. Burbridge's attempts to suggest otherwise were, in my submission, simply unpersuasive. No safety audit has been undertaken which considers the safety of the scheme without the relocation of the speed limit, and this may explain why the issues identified by Ms. Backhouse were not addressed in the road safety audit. Unlike the approach of the road safety audit, which took that approach for understandable reasons, given the scheme it was being asked to assess at the time, we cannot rely on the potential to relocate the speed limit change from the current position in assessing the safety of the proposed access. And I think so that position is common ground, but I set it out just to make that absolutely clear. As a consideration of the documents included within the transport assessment demonstrates, it was only after the road safety audit was completed that the Highways Authority indicated their concerns about the reliance on a change in speed limit. The designers were clear that the change in speed limit was a necessary part of the design, and I set that quote out. Particularly, you'll see the highlighted section, for the proposed access to be contained within the existing speed limit, the access would need to be moved. So you said, I don't read the whole quote out, but you have it in front of you. The point being made in my submission by the designer was that the access had not been designed to be accommodated within the existing speed limit. Seems to me fairly straightforward. That the speed limit change was considered to be a necessary part of the scheme was reiterated as well later in the document, as I took Mr. Burbridge through. And again, I highlight the end of that section, which says, however, this does mean that the access site falls directly on top of the change of speed limit location, which ultimately means that the relocation of the change of speed limit is necessary. And the final paragraph is worth reading as well. So notwithstanding the issue of the access being directly on the signage, the visibility displays requested, brackets 102 meters, can be achieved as shown on the drawing, and the drawing number is provided. So in my submission, the designer could not have been clearer that locating the access on top of the change of speed limit location was inappropriate. The necessity to move the speed limit was not related to achieving appropriate visibility displays, as the final paragraph of that extract makes clear. Mr. Burbridge's answer, given in cross-examination as to why this might have been so, rather called into question the credibility of those who had designed the junction. He suggested that they had pushed this point to get HCC to back down. So, but given that the issue was raised by the designer and not the Highways Authority, it is more likely that this was out of a genuine concern, in my submission, about the appropriateness of that arrangement. And that issue in my submission remains unresolved by the appeal scheme. The relocation of the speed limit cannot be presumed, as I've already said, and the Highways Authority have indicated that it would be unlikely to be effective in any event. So you put a question to Mr. Burbridge in your questions at the end after I cross-examined. I just set out for you the section of the Highways Authority's position on it, and you can obviously read it in context in core document 45. They have said that they would be unable to support the proposed amendment to the TRO and relocation of the change in speed limit, as it would not meet Highways Authority criteria and the road environment is not considered to be suitable. The proposed change in speed limit would be unlikely to have any effect on vehicle speeds on the B3400 through the proposed junction, given the existing road geometry. And so one can take that comment, I say, to be in the context of the proposed scheme, because of course it's a response to the proposed scheme, CD45. As such, we now have a situation where a junction, which was plainly, at least initially, designed to be accommodated within the extended 30 miles an hour speed limit, is being squeezed in between two junctions, Tugate Meadow and the ingress to Burydown Sports Ground, and on top of the existing change in speed limit. It is accepted, of course, that the TA at 5.2.8, the section relied on by Mr. Burbridge in his proof of evidence, eventually asserted that the access could be implemented without the relocation of change in speed limit. But this statement, read in context, as I took Mr. Burbridge through, only concentrates on the issue of visibility displays without consideration of other elements of junction design. And so you will also note that it is directly contrary to the previously stated position of the transport consultant, as I have set out above. It is the local planning authority's case that in consequence of this approach, designing a junction to a 30 mile an hour speed, design speed, when it should have been designed at a circa 40 mile per hour design speed, has led to several unacceptable safety issues. And so I turn to those safety issues now. So as you heard during the inquiry, visibility is unacceptably compromised in 3 identified manoeuvres, which were discussed at length during the inquiry. So if I summarize these by saying manoeuvre 1, manoeuvre 2, and the pedestrian movement at location B, I hope I'll be forgiven for not reading out A, B, and C, which sets out the explanation for those manoeuvres in more detail. I think we're all familiar with them by now. It is so accepted that each obstruction is likely to occur relatively infrequently and to be relatively temporary. It is accepted that these are relevant factors in assessing the acceptability of this compromise to safety. However, Ms. Backhouse, particularly in re-examination, explained that the speed and volume of traffic, as well as the rural nature of the road, meant that in her view, the appropriate visibility standards should not be compromised for this access. Ms. Backhouse was clear in her judgment that each of these matters poses an unacceptable safety risk. And I should say that Mr. Burbridge was equally clear in his opinion that the obstructions to visibility were not unacceptable. So you have 2 competing positions on the point from 2 highways experts. In respect of manoeuvre 1, Ms. Backhouse explained that the approaching westbound driver has priority and so is not expecting to have to slow down or stop abruptly. Given the complexity of the junction arrangement, multiple junctions in relatively close proximity, combined with pedestrian crossings and change of speed limit, the drivers would not be looking at each other, or just be looking at each other, forgive me, or the blind spots, but also at other hazards. Designing a junction with this blind spot is not good practice. Ms. Backhouse disagreed with Mr. Burbridge's assessment that the driver with reduced visibility would be likely to wait for the obstruction to clear. They would not necessarily use the front vehicle as a guide, but may think that the driver is waiting for another reason than an approaching vehicle, or that they have sufficient space to make the turn. In respect of manoeuvre 2, Ms. Backhouse again explained that the approaching eastbound driver has priority as is leaving behind the built-up area of Overton, with an absence of frontage development in this location. They would not be expecting to stop abruptly and would be likely to be accelerating as they left the village. As Mr. Burbridge fairly accepted, one should not have to rely on such emergency stop procedures to make a junction safe. Again, the approaching driver is not just going to be focused on the risk of collision with the vehicle where visibility is impaired, but also other hazards in the vicinity. Nor is the driver whose visibility is impeded necessarily likely to wait for the obstruction to clear. In respect of the pedestrian visibility at point B, Ms. Backhouse explained that the users of this crossing are likely to include unaccompanied children accessing the nursery and sports ground opposite the development. The westbound driver will have priority and will not be expecting to stop. They will not simply be focusing on whether pedestrians are crossing, but also on other hazards associated with the combination of junctions. That these pedestrians may be from outside the new development. Remember, Mr. Burbage's references to Tugate Meadow does not, in my submission, make their safety any less important. The debate over these three instances of reduced visibility demonstrates that whilst there are technical standards to be applied, the application of those standards requires the exercise of judgment. Further, that experienced highways professionals, both witnesses undoubtedly are, I think they both have in excess of 30 years experience, may reach opposing views on issues of safety. It is apparent that HCC also initially harboured concerns about the safety, particularly of manoeuvres 1 and 2, but were ultimately persuaded by the evidence submitted on behalf of the then applicant that the compromise to visibility was on balance acceptable. And so within that sentence, I've given some references. I just draw your attention to those references. You'll see the consultation responses of January and February from the Highways Authority setting out their concerns and ultimately the resolution of their concerns. And you'll see how it's reported in the committee report at page 54 of that report. And so I just ask you to consider those documents because it is explained both in the Highways Authority's response, later response, and the committee report that this is a decision they come to on balance. On balance is used in both documents. And so in my submission, part of that balance, albeit it wasn't entirely accepted by the Highways Authority, was reliance by the transport consultants on a document produced by Atkins concerning the link between visibility at junctions and safety risks. That was, I think, called document 61. Forgive me, I didn't give you the reference there. CB fairly accepted in cross-examination that he didn't rely on the document and believed that PJA were also wrong to do so. He acknowledged that the findings of the report had been mischaracterized in PJA technical note and that the fundamental piece of advice in respect of Ghost Island junctions had not been reported by PJA to the Highways Authority. And so I set that advice out there, except that this is a document concerning particularly trunk roads, but Ghost Island junctions anyway, and that the collision rate is lower for junctions that fully comply with the wire visibility requirements than those that do not. Whilst there's very little difference between the collision rates for the failure categories, we saw those categories are left, right, and both failing. The key finding for Ghost Island junctions is that where there is full compliance, the junction performs better. And so that key finding was not the key finding that was reported by PJA, who are essentially saying there's no correlation between a lack of visibility and collision rates. And that clearly wasn't what the Atkins document demonstrated in respect of Ghost Island junctions. So the committee had before them the views of the Highways Authority and also the evidence of PJA. The committee were plainly, in my submission, aware that there were compromises to visibility in these two manoeuvres in particular, manoeuvres 1 and 2. They had reported to them that HCC were satisfied, on balance, with the reduction. So that did not mean that they had to follow that advice, and they clearly considered the design of the access to present an unacceptable safety risk. That view has since been supported by the expert evidence of Ms. Backhouse. In reaching a decision on this issue, different people will take a more or less precautionary approach. Different judgments will be reached about likely driver behaviour, the character of the road, likely future speeds, how much, if any, of a reduction is safe, and so on. These matters were debated in the evidence and are not repeated in detail here, but they are matters of judgment, sir. Ultimately, the local planning authority has taken a more precautionary approach on this issue than HCC and the appellant because of safety concerns. We invite you to find that the local planning authority were right to do so for the reasons given by Ms. Backhouse, and that these obstructions to visibility would have an unacceptable impact on safety. However, it is recognised, of course, that you'll reach your own view, as others have done, on the extent of the risk and the other factors relevant to consideration of the issue. In addition, sorry, forgive me, I'm just going to have a drink of water. In addition to the highway safety issues which concern visibility, the right-hand turning lane for the site access has been designed to a design speed of 30 miles an hour, meaning that it is substandard. The combined total of the deceleration length and turning length provided is just over 35 metres, which is consistent with the requirement for a minimum deceleration length of 25 metres and a turning length of 10 metres at a design speed of 30 miles per hour. Given the history of the scheme, sir, it is clear why it was designed in this way. We've looked at the documents, just interpose, which show that the designer's original intention was a 30-mile-an-hour design speed, in part because of the relocation of the speed limit. However, at a 40-mile-per-hour design speed, which reflects the actual speeds currently recorded, the necessary deceleration length increases to 40 metres. Mr. Burbridge relied on the lack of queuing at the junction to justify this reduction, but the guidance, and I give you the reference in the footnote, is clear that any queuing length is an additional length to be added, if necessary, to the turning length. Therefore, so the absence of the need for an additional length for queuing does not justify the proposed reduction. Secondly, the fact that drivers could slow down in the main lane, that was the other point that Mr. Burbridge raised. Whilst an element of this may be a normal occurrence, the evidence of Miss Backhouse was that the purpose of a deceleration lane is to allow enough length of road to stop safely in the lane, the deceleration lane, and not to brake suddenly ahead of another driver. Miss Backhouse explained her view, consistent with the minimum standard, that the length of the deceleration lane fails to achieve this, and that it is not appropriate to compromise on this feature given the character of the road. And so we say that taken together, these highway safety issues mean that it is the local planning authority's case that the development is contrary to both development plan policies set out and the relevant part of National Planning Policy Framework. So that addresses reason for refusal 1. I turn then to reason for refusal 2. The National Planning Policy Framework is clear that the creation of high quality, beautiful and sustainable places is fundamental to what the planning and development process should achieve. Whilst many features of the design, for example, the architectural detailing of the dwellings, materials used are acceptable, the evidence of Mr. Butterworth identifies a fundamental issue with the layout of the scheme, which leads him to conclude that overall the scheme is not well designed. In essence, the scheme has not responded positively to topography of the site or the adjacent development, and has not provided for a sensitive transition between the existing development and the countryside. The location of the kickabout area in the northwest of the site contributes to these issues, as does the number of dwellings which are more suburban in form. Taken together, these issues lead Mr. Butterworth to conclude that the scheme gives rise to a perception of a cramped form of development, which is contrary to the development plan policy, national policy and design guidance. Ms. Charles gave her view that the reason for refusal was simply concerned with the number of houses, too many homes in too small an area, was the way she put it in her examination in chief. But that is, in my submission, an overly simplistic analysis. As she accepted in cross-examination, just because a scheme is accepted to be low density, or there is no objection to the number of units per se, it must still be well designed. Whilst whether a development is perceived as being cramped can be analysed by reference to space standards and number of units, and these matters are obviously relevant considerations and may well be helpful. The application of design policy and guidance is not a mathematical exercise. It is more nuanced than that, sir. Mr. Butterworth's evidence identified a conflict with parts 1D, 2A and 2C of EM10, And so I recalled that in cross-examination by Mr. Warren QC, Mr. Butterworth accepted that the real focus was 2A and 2C. His concerns are thus grounded in development plan policy. Mr. Butterworth also carefully set out the relevant parts of local and national design guidance which address issues of topography of the site, locating informal open space relationships with existing development and providing for appropriate layout. The details of that assessment is not repeated here, but can be found in Mr. Butterworth's proof of evidence. Again, sir, in my submission demonstrating that his approach and his planning judgment on these issues is grounded in a consideration of the relevant design guidance at both, that should say, at a local and a national level. And so perhaps I should have set out in detail the design guidance here. I haven't, and I hope I'm forgiven for that, but I do ask you to go back to Mr. Butterworth's proof of evidence, which does detail that and gives you references to the core documents as to where you find the parts of the design guidance he refers to in his analysis. So it is plainly the case that his evidence is grounded in that guidance. His evidence identified 5 main points, which taken together lead him to conclude that the development had, or has, I should say, the perception of a cramped form, which was unsuitable for the rural edge of village location. The layout of the dwellings in the central area, the location of the open space, the missed opportunities for gardens backing onto existing development, the view that a less suburban layout with fewer semi-detached dwellings would be more appropriate for this rural edge village location, the layout of the development with perimeter blocks not being sufficiently broken up for the location. Mr. Butterworth explained that the new development should take the existing topography into account. The site slopes upwards from the northwestern corner of to the southeastern corner, as can be seen from the site visit, and also from the design and access statement on page 6, and the OS extract at paragraph 4.1.20, or I think it's either just above or just below it, so of Mr. Butterworth's proof of evidence. The proposed layout concentrates much of the built form towards the eastern and southeastern part of the site, which extends the built-up area onto the higher parts of the site and away from the existing urban edge. In respect of the open space, Mr. Butterworth explained that the more attractive views would be available for users of open space if it was located on higher ground and towards the southeast of the site. This was one reason why he explained that this would be a better location for the large amenity kickabout area, rather than the current arrangement, which looks towards the rear gardens of existing houses in the new development, and the new development, including flank walls of plot 61 and 67. So I should say it looks towards some fronts of the new development as well. I did not mean to exclude those from that sentence. The southeastern location for the kickabout area is what was originally envisaged and is, as shown illustratively in the site allocation within the neighbourhood plan. He also highlighted, Mr. Butterworth highlighted, consistent with the SPD, that it was important that open space benefits from high levels of natural surveillance, and this could be better achieved by locating the open space towards the southeast of the site, as well as the current arrangements included some frontage development, picked up the point there. It also has a proximate relationship with the existing back gardens and some flank walls of the new development. Further, the relationship with back gardens had the potential for amenity impacts for those residents. Related to this was what Mr. Butterworth termed the missed opportunity for a back-to-back relationship between the existing rear gardens and the rear gardens of the proposed development. Such an approach, as he explained, finds support in the Building for Healthy Life design guidance. In this respect, the proposed development goes against such guidance and instead creates a large buffer between the existing dwellings on Tugate Lane, Nightingale Rise and Waltham Road. The arrangement as currently proposed provides for a large area of suds and informal kickabout space on the western boundary of the site. And this creates a buffer of, give the figures 37 and 95 metres, I think, between the existing edge of Overton and the nearest dwellings in the proposed development. This large buffer does not contribute to a soft urban edge, as it pushes the major built parts of the site closer to the countryside, rather than concentrating the built form closest to the existing built-up area of the village. The result is that this buffer creates a perception of a cramped form of development towards the centre of the site, which is self-contained and not contiguous to the village. Moving the area of open space towards the southeastern areas of the site would create a better buffer with the countryside beyond, and would create a softer edge to the village in line with the general character of the area. Mr. Butterworth recognised that in preferring the southeastern corner of the site for the location of the kickabout area, his view was at odds with that expressed in the committee report. He gave cogent reasons, as summarised already, for why that was his preference, but fairly recognised that there are pros and cons when it comes to matters of design, which call for the exercise of judgment. Finally, in terms of the layout, Mr. Butterworth's evidence explained that the number of semi-detached dwellings, 22 of 82, and the extensive use of perimeter blocks on the proposed development leads to a more suburban character than was suitable for this location, and that the introduction of some more rural features would provide for a layout which felt less cramped and more appropriate to the edge of settlement location. The combination of these elements caused Mr. Butterworth to conclude the development layout of the proposed development would not create a sufficiently soft edge to the village, and would be perceived as a cramped form, of more suburban development. He therefore explained his view that the reason for refusal is justified, and that development would be contrary to development elements of design and sustainability SPD, the parts of the development plan policy EM10 identified, the relevant design guidance, and the national planning policy framework. Ms. Charles gave very different evidence, and was clear in her view that the scheme is well designed. However, as she accepted in cross-examination, that is her subjective judgment, applying the relevant policy, of course, and guidance to the appeal proposal. She has undertaken a similar assessment exercise to that undertaken by Mr. Butterworth, and reached a different conclusion. You will no doubt consider the views of both Mr. Butterworth and Ms. Charles on these issues, but ultimately, sir, you will need to form your own planning judgment. Similarly, as Ms. Charles agreed in cross-examination, whilst the urban design officer was satisfied by the design of the development, that was not a planning judgment the committee were required to follow. The application of design policy is a multifaceted exercise, which in my submission is replete with subjective planning judgments. Reasonable people may reasonably form their own view and different view on the same scheme. A committee, as with an inspector, is not bound to only refuse on design matters if they believe that their view is the only reasonable one. Assisted by the evidence before them, they should assess the merits of the application and form their own judgment. That is the task that the committee undertook in this case, sir, and that is the task that we invite you to undertake, assisted by the evidence before you. Now, sir, just in terms of that subjectivity, it is in my submission clear from Mr. Butterworth's evidence that there is consideration of development plan policy, there is consideration of the local design guidance, there is consideration of the national design guidance, and there is consideration of national policy in the judgments that Mr. Butterworth has presented before you. Now, it may be said that it is not a space standard that he's concerned about, or some other technical breach of a measurement. And so we don't take those sorts of points, but subjective points of design are no less important. There is much discussion at the moment in all forms about the beauty of design and those sorts of matters. And so they are obviously subjective judgments, which reasonable people will take a different view on. and reasonable people are entitled to take a different view on. Ultimately, a committee has to take the view, to grasp the issues before them, and they should not be shy, they should not shirk their responsibility for taking the view that they believe in. And so that is what has happened here. They shouldn't be pressured into a view that they disagree with. And I'll deal with the cost application later, but I'm afraid that that is what the threat of the cost application in a situation like this comes down to. So dealing then with the planning balance, many issues which form part of the planning balance are in agreement between the parties. The site is allocated in the neighbourhood development plan. The principle of residential development on the site is not controversial. There is a lack of 5-year housing supply. There is no dispute that significant weight should be afforded to the delivery of housing and affordable housing, and that the tilted balance is engaged. So from the very outset of this appeal, we have made those points abundantly clear, and we have not sought to take issue with any of them or to argue things that should not be argued. Those points are uncontroversial, and they have formed the basis for our decision making. As Mr. Butterworth explained, despite the tilted balance being engaged, there is no reason to substantially reduce the weight to be afforded to design and highways safety policies, those policies which are particularly engaged by the reasons for refusal stood at large, as these policies remain consistent with the NPPF and do not seek to restrict the delivery of housing, a contrast there, for example, a countryside policy. Instead, they seek to ensure that the scheme is well designed and has a safe access. These, in my submission, remain important policy objectives, even in the context of a lack of 5-year supply. And so, forgive me, I just add there, where the tilted balance is engaged, as Mr. Butterworth's evidence set out, and I don't think he was challenged on this point, it remains a matter of planning judgment for the decision maker as to what weight one applies to out-of-date policies. We accept those policies are rendered out of date, but one then needs to consider the weight. And Mr. Butterworth gives reasons why a substantial reduction in the weight to be afforded to those policies is not justified here. There is a difference between the parties as to the weight to be attached to the other benefits of the scheme. By the other benefits, I mean those other than the delivery of housing and affordable housing. Where the benefits are asserted are essentially what is necessary to make the development acceptable in planning terms. The local planning authority invites you to apply no more than moderate weight to those matters, as detailed in the evidence of Mr. Butterworth. With respect to the approach of Ms. Charles, it is contended that her approach risks an element of double counting of the benefits, and that Mr. Butterworth's approach is to be preferred. So I don't detail those approaches, but you have them in the evidence, and we discussed them recently. Just to conclude then, sir, in respect of reason for refusal 1, the evidence of Ms. Backhouse demonstrated that the introduction of a substandard junction and associated infrastructure on the B3400 London Road would lead to an unacceptable impact on highways safety. This was shown to be contrary to local plan policy CN9 and fails paragraph 111 of the NPPF. In respect of reason for refusal 2, the evidence of Mr. Butterworth demonstrated that the proposed development...
Very sorry, Mr. Defer. I appreciate it's just at the right at the end. I've just had somebody knock on my door. I'm awfully sorry.
Not at all, sir.
You ought to respond. Would you mind?
Absolutely, sir.
Other person from Porlock, Ben.
I do apologise.
Not also, and you may have been trying to attract my attention for some time, but because I'm looking at my screen, I'm afraid I wouldn't have noticed. 2 paragraphs to go, I think. Okay. And we're there. In respect of reason for refusal 2, the evidence of Mr. Butterworth demonstrated that the proposed development, and I've said that twice, does not meet the guidance in the relevant design policies and government guidance, and is therefore contrary to EM10 of the local plan and to the National Planning Policy Framework. Instead, it would result in an unacceptably cramped form of development in relation to the site area. in the local planning authority's submission, these adverse impacts, both individually and cumulatively, are such as to significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits of the scheme when assessed against the policies in the NPPF taken as a whole. And so for those reasons, those summary reasons, we invite you to dismiss the appeal.
Thank you, Mr. Defer. That then draws to a conclusion closing submissions on behalf of the council. Can I turn then to Mr. Warren to do the same on behalf of the appellant, please?
Thank you, sir. You've indicated, sir, that you've got this. I hope Mr. Defer also, I think, said he'd got them. So these are the appellant's closing submissions, sir. And by way of introduction, in short, the appeal scheme is a high quality development and should be granted permission. It would deliver one of the allocated housing sites in the council's area at a time when there is a moderate to serious shortfall in housing land supply. And it's agreed that it would do so fully in accordance with the neighbourhood plan under which it's allocated, an allocation for which the neighbourhood plan records, and I quote it, strong public support. Consent for the appeal scheme would be in accordance with the expert recommendations of the local highway authority and the officers of the council itself. By contrast, sir, the matters still raised against it in defence of the member's decision to refuse permission, alleged unacceptable highway safety implications and alleged cramped layout, are manifestly insufficient objections to the grant of permission, as the evidence at the inquiry has shown. The scheme, sir, as you know, is for 82 homes with a policy compliant level of affordable housing and an appropriate mix of unit sizes and types. Draft condition 1 records the application or appeal drawings for determination, including those which were accepted as minor changes to the scheme under the Wheatcroft principles. You, sir, have a unilateral undertaking, and I just record in the note the progress of the expected addendum to that. That unilateral contains provisions which inform the agreed position as between the appellant, the council and Natural England as to compliance with the habitats regulations in relation to nitrates. And so you, as you know, are the competent authority for the purposes of the appropriate assessment, and you have adequate and agreed information to reach the conclusion that the scheme would comply with the obligation not to have any adverse impact on the SPA through nitrate deposition. So I turn, sir, to the disputed, or if you like, main issues, and I put them in context first of all. The remaining issues relate to highway safety at the site access and whether the layout of the site is cramped. They are main issues by virtue of the fact that they're the only surviving aspects of the members' objections to the scheme. The context for the consideration of those two issues is the degree of agreement about almost every other matter relevant to whether permission should be granted. And so those matters are amply set out in the two statements of common ground between the appellant and the council, and that with the county council. And I don't go into detail, but they include the following. There is no issue in principle with the proposed scheme, given its allocated status. There's no highway safety objection from the relevant highway authority. There's full compliance agreed with the neighbourhood plan and all of the local plan, except 2 or 3 parts of EM10 and CN9. There are no objections on landscape and visual effects, the low density nature of the proposals, open space provision, secure by design, high quality architecture or internal residential amenity. And there would be, it's agreed, a substantial package of benefits, including significant weight agreed to be given to the contribution of the scheme's housing and affordable housing to the shortfall in the district. Now, so those points make it all the more important for any delay to or refusal of this scheme to be properly justified with evidence that withstands scrutiny at this inquiry. That is before one comes to any sensible exercise of the section 38.6 or the framework balances. And so I turn to the first outstanding point, highway safety and the overall position. As the documents before you show, sir, the application now appealed was the subject of extensive highways and transportation assessment. Attention has been drawn to the way in which the appellant's consultants were pushed to satisfy the methodological and evidential requirements of the Highways Authority. For instance, in the use of DMRB guidance for assessment of the junction, and having regard to existing 85th percentile recorded speeds, contrary to the approach that they had argued for. However, a peculiarity in the council's case on highways has been that the insistence that the scheme was designed and promoted on the basis of a 30-mile-an-hour speed limit being introduced across the entire relevant stretch of the B3400 north of the site. Now, so not only is this untrue now, it was untrue at the date of the transport assessment and subsequent technical note when the application was made. The county had rejected the idea of a 30-mile-an-hour TRO change well before then, and the scheme was designed and tested against DMRB and existing speeds. The road safety audit, it's true, was conducted against an understanding that the appellant, then the applicant, of course, intended to seek a 30-mile-an-hour speed limit. But as Mr. Burbridge explained, that didn't in any way constrain the set of safety-related observations that the auditors made. They look at the realities as they observe them. Whether there's a blind spot for pedestrians or right turners obviously applies, whether the speed limit was 30 or 40 miles an hour. And so the road safety audit can be taken, sir, as a relevant assessment of the layout that is applied for. Now, the upshot of this extensive process was that the county had no objection to the proposed access on capacity or safety grounds. Their views should be given significant weight as the statutory expert consultee. There is no reasonable basis for the assertion made by Ms. Backhouse that the Highways Authority simply missed things out of account or got the approach to the transient interference with visibility wrong. Indeed, sir, as I shall come to, it is Ms. Backhouse's approach that is unsupported by the guidance and untenable. It's regrettable that the council's members refused permission on highways grounds without any contrary expert evidence. That was unreasonable, as the evidence now given to defend the decision shows. Ms. Backhouse had not spoken to the county about her points on highway safety, the deceleration lane, the three visibility points, though she did apparently seek clarification on something else. And so, as you know, she maintained 5 points. The first she accepted has nothing to do with the council's reason for refusal. Pedestrian accessibility to facilities in the centre of Overton would be entirely acceptable. As she acknowledged, pedestrians and cyclists would be served by accessible and appropriate routes to the main facilities and the station. None of these would naturally involve going north from the site to the B3400, as Mr. Burbridge illustrated, and Miss Backhouse accepted. Pedestrians from the proposed scheme would cross to the nursery and the sports facility north of the B3400 using the westerly crossing, which is not affected by any visibility point. That crossing is closer to those facilities, would of course be available to others too, including those from Two-Gate Meadow. Now, so that left, firstly, the question of the deceleration lane length into the site access right turn on the B3400. Secondly, the issue of visibility for a pedestrian at the famous point B crossing the westbound carriageway of the road in a southbound direction. And thirdly, the 2 manoeuvres involving the conjunction of a right turning vehicle into Two-Gate Meadow and respectively a right turner into the site access, manoeuvre 1, and a right turner emerging from the site access, manoeuvre 2. So I deal with those points. It's useful to start, sir, with the issue of the deceleration lane, because it requires one to confront the way DMRB guidance should be used in this case, including the need for a reasonable approach to be taken to its application. DMRB, as you know, so was written and designed for trunk roads, where the flows are very high, and the primary strategic objective of the network is to ensure rapid free flow of traffic. Manual for streets, versions 1 and 2, were written for other types of road, but because of the need for a rather more flexible fact-specific set of judgments on roads which serve local distributor purposes, with many accesses and egresses off them, they don't contain the kind of design standards that DMRB does. Now, given the kind of increasingly urbanized multi-access road that the B3400 is becoming through planned housing and other development on this side of Overton, one can readily see why Mr. Burbridge remained sceptical about the preference for DMRB. But so that's by the by. The county is able to use DMRB and did so It used it whilst bearing in mind the kind of road and layout that we have on this side of Overton, and bearing in mind the degree of flexibility that one needs to have when applying a set of standards evolved for a rather different highways context. The issue of the deceleration length is a perfect example of this approach. Figure 6.3a and table 5.22 of DMRB set standards for deceleration lanes in central areas of trunk roads. The total length is 35 metres for design speeds equivalent to 50 kilometres an hour, and 50 metres for design speeds equivalent to 40 or 65 kilometres an hour or thereabouts. Now, so on a trunk road, the primary purpose is to maintain road mainline traffic flows. And the expectation is not that traffic will slow in the main line if it needs to leave. It pulls across into the deceleration lane and uses it to slow down in rather than interfering with the main flows. Now here, by contrast, the County Highways Authority raised no objection to the deceleration lane at 36.5 metres in length, because as Mr. Burbridge said, the flows and how they would operate on the B3400 are different from the way a deceleration lane would operate on a trunk road. Here, a right turner into the new access would slow down and indicate when approaching the right turn lane. The following vehicles wouldn't be surprised by this. There are several minor roads and indeed just accesses like the nursery and sports field to the north off the B3400 on the edge of Overton. Nor is the function of the road the same as the fast uninterrupted flow function of a trunk road. So the risk of a following vehicle ploughing into the back of a right turner is minimal, hence why the full deceleration lane referable to a trunk road is unnecessary. DMRB, sir, is clear that it's designed for trunk roads and motorways, and that on other roads, the local authority chooses how to use the guidance. And I quote it, where DMRB requirements are applied to other roads, the specific highway or local road authority acting as the overseeing organisation should decide on the extent to which the requirements are appropriate in any given situation. And so for those reasons, you sir should know, we would suggest the approach of the county and their satisfaction with the entire layout as expressed in the Statement of Common Ground on Highways. Now, so Ms. Backhouse relied on speeds in the survey being 85th percentile, just over 40 miles an hour. Even if they stayed at that level, these points all apply. And Mr. Burbridge is likely to be right, however, that there would be a diminution in speed of some kind with the introduction of a new pair of bollarded right turns, street lights, road markings, general urbanisation of the road in this location. And as he observed of the council's Overton Hill example, put to him in cross-examination, when cars slow before the right turn there, that is what is likely to happen when eastbound cars have a right turner in front of them, indicating to turn into the deceleration lane. Now, so Ms. Backhouse did not grapple at all with the correct approach when seeking to apply DMRB to a road like the B3400 in this location. Her approach was a mechanistic or dogmatic application of the guidance and an automatic assumption that any dimension below that in the table indicated an unacceptable safety hazard. And so such a conclusion is diametrically at odds with the county's position. So Ms. Backhouse fell back on alleging that the county hadn't thought about the point at all. So that itself is inconsistent with the Statement of Common Ground, which covers the whole junction and is completely implausible, especially since Ms. Backhouse apparently failed to put such a suggestion to the county when she contacted them. I turn to point B, use of the eastern pedestrian refuge in the island.
Yes, I think it's probably western
side. I knew that would happen in these submissions. I'm so sorry. So the western pedestrian refuge in the island, point B, is likely to be restricted to those coming from Tugate Meadow area and going to the sports field or nursery. Otherwise, as I've said, one would simply use the more direct route and crossing to the east. Ms. Backhouse claims that it would be unacceptably dangerous to cross there due to a transient blind spot, which arises on the infrequent occasions that there's a car waiting to turn right into the site access. Now, so Ms. Backhouse was quite clear that her approach was that no interruptions of sight lines are allowed and that any such interruption was unacceptable. But a few moments' consideration shows that she, with due respect to her, closed her mind to a reasonable judgment. Firstly, the time a car is in the point B blind spot at 40 miles an hour is just over 1.5 seconds. And at 30 miles an hour, only 2 seconds. We know that because the pedestrian is in almost exactly the same location or line of sight as the notional right turner into Two-Gate Meadow that I'm going to come on to. Secondly, the pedestrian at point B can see approaching cars well before they go into the blind spot, and of course when they emerge. That in many cases the car in the blind spot would be visible through the turning car, especially when, as with most modern cars, the oncoming car has its headlights on. Fourthly, Miss Backhouse's approach assumes that a pedestrian hasn't even glanced to the left when crossing the eastbound carriageway in order to arrive at point B. And then that he or she steps out across the westbound carriageway in under 2 seconds, having seen a stationary car waiting to cross into Two-Gate Lane. Again, so that's completely implausible. The pedestrian is not only likely to have looked across to see if he or she can go straight across the road in one go, thereby seeing any car about to go into the blind spot, but would also have naturally formed the view that because the right turner is stationary, I should say, there may be something coming westbound. And the idea that the pedestrian would perhaps think that the car was waiting because there are pedestrians crossing the sight access, so is again unrealistic. And frankly, by the time it takes just to size up the situation, any car that was, to use Miss Backhouse's word, momentarily hidden in the blind spot would have appeared. So added to which the right turner is only there for a maximum of 5 or 6 seconds, extremely infrequently. Now, so these are really just common sense points. Neither the road safety auditor, who was looking at a situation with a blind spot in it in just the same way, nor the county council thought there was any safety issue here. And so I leave aside the fact that at the moment, someone from Two-Gate Lane, Two-Gate Meadow, that should be, forgive me, Two-Gate Meadow, would be likely to nip across the road to the nursery fields without any pedestrian refuge, since the alternative is a huge diversion westwards to the nearest crossing point. So I leave that aside, but not only is the situation entirely manageable and straightforward, even in the case of an accidental or a very ill-judged move by the pedestrian, ample emergency stopping distance is available for a car moving westward at the blind spot. And so there is therefore no basis for a reasonable judgment that the new crossing point is unacceptably dangerous. I turn to manoeuvre 1. So as for the risks to right turners into Two-Gate Meadow, if a car is waiting to turn into the new access at precisely the same moment, many of the same points apply. The blind spot hides a car for between 1.5 and 2 seconds. The driver going to Two-Gate Meadow can see cars who haven't got to the blind spot, and obviously those emerging from it. The driver can see that the sight access driver is stationary, i.e. that something is stopping him from pulling across the westbound carriageway. Now, so by the time that's registered, and the obvious consideration, there is a car coming I can't quite see, any car in the blind spot has been revealed. Now, the argument advanced by Miss Backhouse includes the idea that the junction is very complex and that the Two-Gate Lane driver, Meadow, I think I should say, sorry, I keep doing that, the Two-Gate Meadow driver would be confused and may pull out. But the very most important thought for a driver making that maneuver is not to be hit by something westbound. A moment or two's consideration of the situation reveals the notional blind spot car, and there's no danger. So furthermore, the safety of a junction also needs to be seen in the context of how a particular situation would arise. There was no challenge to the probability work that the appellant's consultants carried out. And it shows that the conjunction of vehicles required for the manoeuvre 1 scenario to occur is very improbable. Miss Backhouse herself framed it as infrequent, but the numbers are rather starker than that. In the PM peak hour, that's the worst case, the probability is only 1 in around 3,700. In the other peak, 1 in 20,600. And for the rest of the 24 hours, of course, the likelihood is infinitesimal because there are so few properties and therefore movements involved. The same point can be made about the very worst case. As Mr. Burbridge robustly put it, the idiotic driver who turns towards Two-Gate Meadow without waiting 2 seconds to see if there's something coming. There is still more than enough emergency braking distance to enable the westbound driver to stop, even if the turner is still in the carriageway. So this isn't, as Mr. Burbridge made clear, a design based on emergency stops, but the point is that even in the case of an unforeseen piece of recklessness, the risk of a collision is very low. Now, so the county took exactly this line. They referred to the low incidence of the manoeuvre and took a view about the safety of the access, all things considered. Although a judgment, it is, sir, an obvious one to have reached in the circumstances. So in relation to manoeuvre 2, sir, the blind spot for the emerging right turner lies behind the Two-Gate Meadow right turning vehicle. It's a little more extensive than that in manoeuvre 1, as Mr. Burbridge's diagrams show. But again, many of the same points apply, and there is another obvious reason why this manoeuvre is not dangerous. Firstly, the oncoming vehicle would be seen for 80 metres behind the turner into Two-Gate Meadow, plus, of course, the through visibility point, the lights and so on. And vehicles can be seen before they enter the blind spot going east. Again, in the case of reckless driving, there would be more than enough time and space to stop if you're the eastbound vehicle. But so this is the new point here. Thirdly, the stationary right turner into Two-Gate Meadow, the one causing the obstruction, is most likely to be there because there is an approaching vehicle westbound on the B3400, which would itself preclude the emerging vehicle from crossing out onto the carriageway anyway. And so the posited dangerous manoeuvre is very unlikely ever to be possible. And so that's the point which applies to, as I say, manoeuvre 2 only. In other words, as soon as there's no westbound vehicle in near sight, the Two-Gate lane, the Two-Gate Meadow, that should be, the Two-Gate Meadow turner would move and there would be no blind spot. This particular conjunction, again, sir, would be really very infrequent indeed. The numbers of right turners are extremely small, 14 into the 82 unit appeal scheme in the worst case PM peak, one every 4 minutes, 20 seconds on average, staying for say 5 seconds, and therefore clearly fewer, perhaps half as many, into the 38 unit Two-Gate Meadow scheme. That's why the conjunction of the two vehicles is so improbable. 1 to 3,150 in the PM peak and 1 to 3,624 in the AM peak. So the council's argument as put to Mr. Burbridge seemed to be one, as I've said, based on the alleged complexity of the access arrangements. There's quite a lot going on, I think it was the way that it was put. He made it clear that this isn't, in fact, a difficult or complicated arrangement, and one self-evident point must be grappled with by the council. The right turner at Two-Gate Meadow, if he or she arrives a second or two into the other cars around 5 or 6 second pause at its turning point, will be looking eastwards, and wondering if she or he should turn and asking the most obvious basic question: why is that car not going across into its access? The idea that the Two-Gate Meadow driver then pulls out without waiting the very few seconds he can be sure there's nothing coming because he's confused by the junction, so I'm afraid is completely implausible. So in summary, Miss Backhouse found this access unacceptable because her approach is to regard any interruption, however fleeting, however infrequent, and however navigable with basic common sense as unacceptable in principle. She forgets that DMRB itself permits encroachment of new priority junctions into the visibility requirements of adjacent priority junctions if, as here, the speed limit is no greater than 40 miles an hour and the minor junction is not a through route. This kind of transient effect isn't objectionable in principle, nor is it a breach in inverted commas of DMRB on its own terms, and when applied here, it is clear that the risk of accident is very low. Had the council relied on evidence which took the correct approach to DMRB, including to what it says expressly, and applied it realistically, then at the very least they might have produced evidence which went some way to substantiating the reason for refusal in the face of the highway authority's position. Unfortunately, Miss Backhouse's evidence fell far short, sir, of that. The scheme, we say, would fully accord with policy CN9. And we would therefore invite you, sir, to conclude that there is no reasonable evidence indicating an unacceptable safety risk posed by the site access junction. So I turn to cramped development, in inverted commas, reason for refusal 2. Ms. Charles pointed to the terms of this reasoned refusal and how it arose. She advised that it would be inappropriate to refuse permission for the appeal scheme on the basis of, quotes, overdevelopment. The members decided to allege that the scheme was cramped, quotes, in relation to the site area. Now, as she said, that appears plainly to be an allegation of too many houses when seen against the size of the site. Mr. Butterworth, called to give evidence on behalf of the council on this reasoned refusal, doesn't even attempt to argue that there are too many houses proposed for the site, or that the density is too great, or that there is any breach of the approximately 70 indication or the indicative red or blue lines in the site F of policy SS1 of the neighbourhood plan. The fundamental answer to this mistaken reason for refusal is that there are not, in fact, too many houses proposed for the site area. Inevitably, therefore, Mr. Butterworth had to have recourse to a set of highly tendentious points about the layout. They stemmed from two basic points: that the layout was too suburban in form, with too many semi-detached houses, and that the layout should have put the open space in the southeast corner, thereby allowing housing lower down into the northwest and western parts of the site, and avoiding what he claimed were undesirable consequences for neighbours. Now, so I come to the reasons why those points do not remotely add up to an objection in a moment. But first, I draw your attention to the protective padding, if I can call it that way, that the council attempted to put in place around Mr. Butterworth's evidence. The idea that these points are all subjective, matters of judgment, that the members of Mr. Butterworth are entitled or have the right to express them, and we simply disagree. Now, so having the legal right as members, or the right in general to say something, does not entail that what is said is reasonable. Otherwise, there would be no costs regime in relation to many decisions, which are usually, if not always, matters of planning judgment with subjective elements. The costs regime is not disapplied in relation to issues where there may be subjective elements in play. And this appeal is a stark example of the right to disagree with the planning officers being exercised unreasonably, and of evidence called not coming place to substantiating a refuse. And obviously, so there is a point I take up again in the cost application. But here, sir, Mr. Butterworth's main points, which he combined, if you remember, for his overall judgment, were, and I set them out, so I won't read those out, they're the 6 points that we canvassed. So those points, before they're even interrogated, are the flimsiest of responses to the agreed merits of the scheme in layout and design terms. So the site is an allocated housing site for at least 70 units, 82 units in the same ballpark is not said to be out of step with the allocation. So the site would in any event be home to 82 units of housing. The layout in line with MPPF paragraphs 124 and 5 is agreed to make efficient and effective use of land, which, as Mr. Butterworth acknowledged, is what criterion 1D of policy EM10 is aimed at. Thirdly, so the street layout is properly sized for the scheme. It's neither too narrow or too wide. It doesn't have any compromises like places where waste collection lorries can't pass or would have to execute awkward maneuvers. Fourthly, the types of buildings in terms of mix of small, medium and large units are all agreed to be in line with policy. Fifth, there's no objection to the size, to the quality or usability of the open spaces within the scheme, perhaps size in particular important there. There's not a single issue raised by reference to the internal standards of the layout. Space standards, garden space standards, back-to-back distances, privacy, overshadowing, daylight and sunlight standards, i.e. there are no indicators or symptoms, as I put it, of overdevelopment within the layout of the scheme. Seventh, there's no objection to the landscaping proposed for the site or to the effect of the scheme on landscape and visual values in the area. For instance, no breach is alleged of the highly pertinent neighbourhood plan policy LBE1, which is aimed at conserving the character and appearance of Overton's built and natural environment. And finally, so the layout of the scheme was the subject of unqualified approval by the urban design, landscape, open space and planning case officers, whose expert views were reported to members. So to take Mr. Butterworth's first point, suburban character, he began this part of his evidence, you'll recall, in chief by referring to the Design and Sustainability SPD and claiming that this scheme was contrary to its advice on designing in a rural location. However, he accepted that the site isn't in such a location, that it's in an allocated edge of settlement site which would form part of a large village, and one should not apply the rural design guidance inflexibly to it. The way this aspect of Mr. Butterworth's evidence wilted under challenge provides an insight into something fundamentally wrong about the reason for refusal. There's nothing rational about judging whether the layout is acceptable simply as the reason for refusal has it in relation to the site area. One obviously has to look at the context, which is all, as Mr. Butterworth put it. And so the context here, as you know, is a very well contained site on the edge of a large village in close proximity to mainly residential development of an almost indistinguishable general character from that which is proposed. There are perimeter blocks, semi-detached, detached, short terrace rows within 100 metres of the site. There are two-storey, relatively modest housing with a general appearance which fits the edge of settlement location, neither very urban nor, whether really or artificially, rural in character. So Mr. Butterworth accepted that the character of the scheme as proposed was not dissimilar to that in the context. And so that's really the end of the point. It was agreed that cramped means something like uncomfortably small or restricted. As seen in its Overton context, that is not a remotely fair description of the scheme. Mr. Butterworth's evidence was that the amount of homes that were attached to at least one other home, that 50%, was an indicator that the scheme was cramped. Now, so actually nearly 80% of the homes are either detached or semi-detached, and with the scale and massing of the semi-detached pairs being modest. That can readily be seen from any of the layout drawings. And no evidence was given pointing to any part of the layout where accumulation or conjunction of built form was said to give rise to an uncomfortably restricted appearance or character. The semis and few sets of apartments are set in ample space, and as Miss Charles observed, actually serve to make the development more spacious. They are an efficient way to develop the site. So the point was, with respect, a completely empty one. The immediate context is replete with a very similar range of detached, semi-detached and terraced housing. The SPD even shows semi-detached and terraced buildings in its illustration of a yet more rural layout. The spaces between the buildings would be ample and include the roads and important central pedestrian movement corridor, include the planted open spaces and the gardens themselves, an overall effect best appreciated by reference to the landscape master plan. The interlocking gardens point, thirdly, says something which is a missed opportunity is only the basis, sir, for an objection if what is proposed instead is less good or harmful. There's little justification for applying the very general guidance in the SPD about backing on to existing gardens in this layout. Notably, the design solution proposed is for a site which only has a short boundary to existing gardens. The point Mr. Butterworth makes doesn't apply at all in relation to the two-gate lane side of the site, which is sensitively handled with large areas of open space and limited housing set well back from it. And it doesn't apply, obviously, to the east or to the south. The small area at the top of Waltham Road and Nightingale Close might have been treated that way, but there's no need to design the scheme that way. In fact, had housing been disposed in that way, as Ms. Charles identified, several notable benefits of the scheme would have been foregone. The welcome openness on the corner by Moore's Farm, the siting of the kickabout area in a location which would make it genuinely available to existing as well as new residents, the optimal location for well-designed suds drainage and visual openness, and a point that I shall return to in a moment, a thought-through buffer to the gardens of existing housing. So there's no substantive planning or design harm here through not interlocking what would be a very few gardens. The remains of reason for refusal 3 reside in Mr. Butterworth's concern that the kickabout space would result in harm to the amenity of neighbours and the creation of opportunities for antisocial behaviour. Now, so if either of those points had any merit, one might have expected at least a trace in the consultation responses by the open space officer, the EAHO, or the designing out crime officer. As you know, none of them had any objections to the kickabout or indeed the scheme as a whole. Mr. Butterworth accepted that he couldn't allege unacceptable noise impacts on the neighbours. They have large gardens and the kickabout area is simply a piece of grass for informal play, which, as Ms. Charles said, was designed with a buffer around it to the council's specification. And the purpose of the buffer is to ensure no unacceptable noise impacts from such space. The space is relatively open. It won't be a thicket of trees or bushes concealing nefarious activity. The boundary treatment will be appropriate, as will boundary planting, controlled obviously by condition. The rest of what is not a huge area will be visually open and well surveilled by new housing and from the public domain. Access to the back gardens of neighbours is not enabled or likely for these reasons, and nor is the space easily exploited for antisocial behaviour. Now, so the main point about the kickabout was a slightly slippery one, whether it would be better or worse or the same to have the kickabout in the southeast corner. And Mr. Butterworth made it clear that this was not a point in the end about non-compliance with the indicative allocation drawing, but something about the qualities of the space. But again, so on analysis, there's simply nothing in this point. There would be no obvious benefit to the usability of the space were it located there, though it could be designed with houses nearby to give surveillance. There's no real open view from that location. So as you'll see, due to the presence, even in winter, of a substantial planted and treed boundary to the east and across the remainder of the agricultural field to the south also. Mr. Butterworth accepted, secondly, that the development as proposed would not have a harsh urban edge for much of the same reason. The large tree and hedge belt would be supplemented by a buffer some 20 metres deep with tree planting in it, and to the south there would be agricultural land, but then again a thick treed and hedged boundary to the wider countryside. There are no views in or out to wider countryside locations, as Mr. Butterworth indicated. Thirdly, so the siting of housing on the higher gradients of the slope is of course envisaged by the allocation itself, having been through the neighbourhood plan process. Regardless of the location of the indicative open space on that drawing, which simply reflects the very notional Taylor-Wimpey ideas for the site when it was being considered, before detailed design, drainage and so on, housing is proposed even in the smaller red-lined area, which is at the highest level. So the allocation enables housing to be built on the southeastern part of the site in any event. And as Mr. Butterworth accepted, the allocation is not subject to any stipulation, such as keeping the southeastern corner free from built development. That would be contrary to the indicative drawing. So as Ms. Charles said, one might have a successful design with open space to the southeast, but that's not the same thing as the current scheme being harmful, let alone the result being uncomfortably restricted. And so the last point on topography is really connected. The idea that the southeastern corner housing would be higher and therefore somehow out of character and too prominent. Now, so it's unclear whether this point was thought through at all. It's blindingly obvious that there would be less rather than more openness perceptible if one developed housing in the lower north and northwestern parts of the site, i.e. where the suds and the kickabout are proposed to be. The only views into the site that Mr. Butterworth identified, i.e. from Tewgate Lane and through gaps in housing on Waltham Road, would be taken up with much closer and more prominent housing. And the levels and perspective would mean that they would largely block or merge with housing further up the slope. But more fundamentally, the disposing of well-spaced housing on the gentle valley slope is contextually appropriate. Mr. Butterworth's own photograph looking west towards the nearby Overton housing shows exactly that. Housing on gently rising land with elevations and roofs overlapping and glimpses of wooded ridges. Mr. Butterworth accepted that the site as proposed to be laid out would have a similar character, including the visibility of mature tree canopies above even the housing on the highest part of the site. So there's no landscape or visual harm case, no important or, quotes, valued landscape, no identified views in play. The presence of housing on the slope represents appropriate contextual design and provides no support for the idea that the scheme is cramped. And so for those reasons, there would be no aspect, let alone overall effect of the scheme, which would reasonably be described as uncomfortably restricted or cramped. And the reason for refusal and that part of 3 now wrapped up in it are totally without merit. On benefits, this section can be taken shortly, although obviously it's important. Shortly because the access would not be unsafe and the layout would not be cramped, and therefore the scheme would be in complete accordance with the provisions of the development plan. The framework bids us treat the most important policies, which inevitably include EM10 and I think that should say CN9, shouldn't it? CN9, as out of date, because there is no 5-year housing land supply. But it's not said by either party that any relevant policy should be given less weight for that reason. And of course, as you know, the tilted balance is engaged. Mr. Butterworth rightly acknowledged that the appeal proposals would bring a substantial set of benefits. Significant weight should be given, he agreed, to both the contribution to housing and that to affordable housing. And that's because of the moderate to serious deficit in the 5-year supply. And despite a couple of good years of delivery of affordable housing, the likelihood of a deficit there too, in line with overall under delivery, given the very heavy emphasis placed in the framework on the maintenance of the basic housing land supply to ensure that the country substantially increases its supply of housing, there is no question but that very significant weight should be given to these factors. Ms. Charles rejected the idea that using land efficiently and delivering the plan-led housing in Overton were essentially double counting. She was right, those are connected, but freestanding policy objectives at the national level. Similarly, she was correct to urge that significant weight be given to the economic benefits of the proposal, rather than Mr. Butterworth's moderate weight. Her approach is more in line with paragraph 81 of the framework, and especially in a large village like Overton, jobs, the influx of expenditure and contributions are real-world benefits to which significant weight should be given. The biodiversity net gain at 6.7% is all extra over the basic nil detriment requirement of policy and should be given due weight. The fact it's provided off-site is far from the objection to it. It actually allows the maximisation of the benefit in a setting divorced from the edge of Overton. In addition to compliance with the development plan, therefore, sir, the appeal proposals benefit from the presumption in favour of sustainable development. There is no question of harms significantly and demonstrably outweighing the benefits in this case. So by way of overall conclusion, sir, you will remember that the neighbourhood plan was adopted in July 2016, and this application was made in March 2020. It went to committee on the 28th of April 2021. Mr. Butterworth confirmed that reasons 3, 4 and 5 are all matters expected to be resolved by condition or section 106 in the light of a resolution to grant permission. However, the 2 reasons maintained by the council simply do not provide a reasonable basis on which to refuse the planning permission, which should have been granted some time ago. And so the appellant therefore respectfully requests that, subject to the final section 106 documentation and to conditions as discussed, the appeal be allowed and planning permission granted. Thank you, sir.
Ms. Warren. Okay, so we come to the end of closings. I'll turn to the issue of costs. I now have a cost submission from Mr. Warren on behalf of the appellants. I haven't seen it, and I don't suppose that Mr. Defer has seen it. I'm going to ask you, Mr. Defer, how long you think you need to have to respond to it. We've agreed that that will be in writing. Do you need an adjournment to skim read it to help you, or have you been able to have a look at it?
I've skim read it. I think it's a fairly short document. I think 5 pages. As Mr. Warren says within it, it relies in part on what he said in closing, which obviously I've just heard for the first time. I've foreshadowed some of the points in my closing, sir, and I think I can deal with it relatively briefly in reply. I think if I had until the end of today, that would be very helpful. And I'll just get on with it this afternoon. I've got another inquiry to prepare for, which starts in a week's time. So in a way, it'd be nice to get things done.
Yeah, I agree with you. It would be good to try and get that done out of the way. Okay, so that's fine. I'm happy. So till the end of play today to submit your response. Mr. Warren, you obviously have a final right of reply. May I suggest that end of play on Monday would be a reasonable amount of time for you to respond, if in fact you need to decide
That's very kind, sir. Thank you. As I indicated, it's unlikely, but thank you very much. If necessary, I will by the end of it.
Okay. So in terms of outstanding submissions, then Mr. Defer for the cost rebuttal end of the day. Mr. Warren, final comment by end of Monday. The only other then document that I'm going to be awaiting on is the addendum to the section 106. And I think from what we heard from Mr. Johnson yesterday, 7 days should be sufficient for him to get that signed and engrossed. So that would be next Friday. So that would be the 22nd. Okay.
So just to give you some comfort on that last point, I think the parties are already discussing the addendum, and I think there is already a draft helpfully prepared by Mr. Johnson. So I think that's in train.
Okay,
Yes.
super. Good. Thank you for that. Moving on then to my site visit. As I've said, my intention is to do it on Monday. My intention is still to do it unaccompanied, unless there is some good reason why other people wish to tag along. Has anybody indicated that there is some such reason?
No.
Not from us, sir.
Good. In that case, I'll do that. I've been making obviously notes of suggestions from as we've been going along as to where I need to view it from. Clearly, I'll obviously be looking at the B3400 and the various points along the various access points to Gate Meadow and the sports club on the other side of the road, speed limit change and so on. The site itself, I'll obviously be looking at that. I will, in addition to that, be looking to pop into Gate Meadow, Overton Hill, both parts of it, the bit off the 3400 and the bit off Station Road. I'll have a walk along Waltham Road just to see what I can see through gaps between buildings. I shall go and have a quick look at the mitigation land as well, and just generally in the general area, just to see how the site appears from more distant views. Is there any other aspects that any party would wish to draw to my attention in addition to those points?
Not from us, sir. That sounds like a very sensible list.
Agreed.
Good. Right. Well, in that case, we're drawing to a close for the inquiry. I'll just give one final chance for anything else to be said that hasn't been covered that people think they ought to. No. Good. Well, if there are no further questions, then I'd like to thank you both, in fact, and witnesses for your participation during the week. That's going to be helpful to me in my reaching a decision. So with the site visit details agreed, I shall hereby close the inquiry. Thank you.
Please, sir.
I will if I can find my mouse. There we go.
Thank you.
Cheerio, Ben.
Bye.
See you. Thanks very much.
Bye.